Well, good morning.
Good morning.
I want to welcome all the mothers. Glad that you're here. Happy Mother's Day. We are getting ready to begin our class, but I want you to feel free just to keep eating, enjoying yourself. Get up, get a cup of coffee or a pastry or some fruit, yogurt, chocolate-covered strawberries. I personally taste tested one of those. It wasn't enough, so I had another. If that wasn't enough, I had a third one. No, I'm just kidding. I did have one, though. It was very good. Also, you can take the flower arrangements. If you want it, one per family, one per household, I guess. But you are welcome to take those if you would like to have it. Anything else that needs to be announced? We were going to have a divorce care volunteer meeting this afternoon. I forgot it was Mother's Day when I set that up. We're going to postpone that until next week. So next Sunday, after the morning service, if you would like to help with divorce care, that means providing food. That means just volunteering to be in there as support. If we have a volunteer that would really like to take control of DC4K, that's Divorce Care for Kids, we'd like to, we would love to offer that. Or child care, maybe you don't want to do the Divorce Care for Kids, but you would be willing to help with child care. There's lots of roles. So we invite you to attend that meeting next Sunday morning, right after church services. It won't be a long meeting. It will be in this room. Because divorce care is getting ready to start in June. I would love for you to get a bulletin. There's a QR code on there. Point your camera at it. A link will pop up. You can take attendance that way. Also, if you can, bookmark that form. And that way you don't need the QR code. You can just do that at every service. You have to fill one out at every service. One for Bible class and then one for worship. All right. We are going through the Gospel of Mark. We have come to probably the toughest chapter in Mark. Mark chapter 13. You are going to want to have a Bible. So pull it up on your phone or get an old-fashioned paper copy. During the first Gulf War, 1990, 1991, I noticed that a lot of preachers changed their preaching during the conflict. Did you notice that? And it continued on with each conflict thereafter. No matter what they had been preaching about prior to the conflict, it seemed like they changed their topic to end-time Bible prophecy. Lots of books came out. Lots of money was made with those books coming out. You couldn't listen to religious programming on the radio or TV without end-time prophecy being the topic. Well, I've since learned that times of war, times of conflict are like that because we feel so unsettled during those times. Christians find it difficult to resist the temptation to speculate about the significance of the war as it relates to biblical prophecy. Now, I have an opinion on end-time Bible prophecy, and the books that come out and all of that, I think it's pretty prideful, egotistical. To think we are the special ones. Of all the people that lived in throughout history and time, to think we are the special ones. The whole Bible was talking about us. It's coming to an end right here, right now with us. Now, I don't know when it's coming to an end. I don't think they know either. And I think this particular text is misquoted, misinterpreted quite severely. So we're going to talk about it this morning. This has been true of Christians of every generation going back 2,000 years at least. They all thought, this is it. They looked at the signs, they looked at what was going on, the situations, and they thought, this is it, this is the end. And yet here we are 2,000 years later, still. You realize many Christians said the same thing back in World War I, World War II, Vietnam. It's the end. It's ready. The signs are there. You know, they start looking at, okay, we have earthquakes, we have wars and rumors of wars, we have all, and time just keeps marching on. When World War I broke out, a Christian leader by the name of C.I. Scofield, you've heard of that name? Speculated it was the start of Armageddon. World War I. World War II, they said the same thing. In fact, identifying the Antichrist and predicting the Battle of Armageddon has become an American obsession. Especially when we have difficult times of war or conflict or difficulty of some sort. I have mixed feelings about the trend. On the one hand, I think it's good for Christians to look forward to Jesus' second coming. We're supposed to. We're supposed to look forward to it. He certainly promised to return again to receive his own and take them home. Looking forward to Christ's second coming gives us hope in the midst of despair, resolve in the midst of discouragement. But on the other hand, living our lives too far into the future can lead us to neglect of life in the now. And that's what we're talking about this morning. There's a big difference between living our lives today in light of Christ's second coming and living our lives totally focused on the future. So we've been going through the Gospel of Mark. We've arrived at chapter 13. We've been learning how to live as disciples of Jesus in our world today. The last few weeks we've been looking at events of what Christians call Holy Week. It all started on Palm Sunday with Jesus coming into Jerusalem on a colt. Remember, we just recently talked about that. And on his way to the Jewish temple that day, Jesus cursed a fig tree. Why did he curse it? Do you remember?
No fruit.
There was no fruit. It was in leaf. It was looking like it was supposed to have fruit, but it didn't have fruit. So he cursed it. Once he got to the temple, Jesus caused a scene. What did he do when he arrived at the temple?
Upturn the tables.
Overturned the tables, ran out the money changers. He just caused an incredible scene by overturning the tables of the money changers, caused the sacrifices to stop for a little while. And just as the fig tree was cursed from the root up for its barrenness, or its barrenness, the temple was also being judged because it was barren. Even though there was lots of activity, even though there were lots of things happening there, Jesus determined that it was barren. And in a sense, he curses the temple as well, or at least what's going on there. It had outlived its usefulness. Jesus, in a sense, is saying, I am now the temple. You are now the temple. Things are changing quickly. And then the next day, there was a series of debates with various groups of religious leaders, and each debate was designed to catch Jesus in a trap. He was far too smart. He wouldn't fall for it. Now, you might notice that the common thread in these various events from chapter 11 has really been the temple. From chapter 11 all the way to chapter 13, we've really been focusing on the temple. Don't know if you've caught that. And now in chapter 13, Jesus continues talking about the impending doom of the temple. In fact, I almost called today's message Jesus Christ in the Temple of Doom. There's already a movie taken with that name, almost. Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom. But here we are, Mark chapter 13. Let's read the text. You may not be able to see it up on the screen, so follow along, but this is the Message version. As he walked away from the temple, one of his disciples said, "Teacher, look at that stonework, those buildings." Jesus said, "You're impressed by this grandiose architecture? There's not a stone in the whole works that is not going to end up in a heap of rubble." Later, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives in full view of the temple, Peter, James, and John and Andrew got him off by himself and asked, "Tell us, when is this going to happen? What sign will we get that things are coming to a head?" Jesus began, "Watch out for doomsday deceivers. Many leaders are going to show up with forged identities claiming I'm the one. They will deceive a lot of people. When you hear of wars and rumored wars, keep your head and don't panic. This is routine history and no sign of the end. Nation will fight nation and ruler fight ruler over and over. Earthquakes will occur in various places. There will be famines. But these things are nothing compared to what's coming. And watch out, they're going to drag you into court. And then it will go from bad to worse, dog eat dog, everyone at your throat because you carry my name. You're placed there as sentinels to truth. The message has to be preached all across the world. When they bring you betrayed into court, don't worry about what you'll say. When the time comes, say what's on your heart. The Holy Spirit will make his witness in and through you. It's going to be brother killing brother, father killing child, children killing parents. There's no telling who will hate you because of me. Stay with it. That's what is required. Stay with it to the end. You won't be sorry. You'll be saved. Well, this sermon is called the Sermon on the Mount of Olives. That's what it's usually referenced as. And today we're looking at the first half of this sermon. It continues on, but that will be next week. It's the longest teaching block in all of Mark's story. Everything else has been very brief, very concise, to the point. He took some time to really focus on this sermon in particular. It must mean it's pretty important. The immediate question is, what is Jesus talking about in this text? In your opinion, what's he talking about?
In my opinion, it's the beginning of the process of the leaving Jerusalem in the wake and the destruction of Jerusalem.
Okay. Yeah, it's the beginning of the process of Jesus telling them, you need to leave Jerusalem. Jerusalem's going to fall. It seems like Jesus starts this sermon talking about one thing and ends it talking about something entirely different. And that has made this sermon notoriously difficult for Christians to understand and apply to their lives. One possibility is that this whole sermon is about the Jewish revolt against Rome, 66 to 70 AD. That's one possibility. He's talking about the Jewish revolt. They're finally going to rise up and fight Rome. In this event, it certainly appears to be where Jesus starts. I think that's how he begins, which is what Cecil just said. He begins warning about the fall of Jerusalem. Now, by the way, that should tell you they lose the revolt. I mean, you're fighting the Roman Empire. That's David against Goliath. You're going to lose that one. But he's been focusing on the destruction of the Jewish temple since chapter 11. And as they leave the temple after a series of debates, Jesus and his closest disciples walk over to the Mount of Olives. If you remember geography class, you got Jerusalem way up on the mountain, the Kidron Valley, the Mount of Olives right over here. So they leave Jerusalem, go down through the Kidron Valley, up to the Mount of Olives. That was a favorite place of Jesus. It was an olive grove with an olive press. That's why they called it Mount of Olives. And they sit down where they can see the temple. They have to remember the temple is huge. It is massive. And they're just looking at its glory. Probably the largest, most elaborate religious temple in the entire ancient world was this temple.
One of the antithesis of the very great.
And Jesus' disciples are awestruck because Jesus sat down. Now, this is no accident, right? Everything Jesus does is on purpose. So he sits in a place where they're looking right at the temple, across the valley, over into Jerusalem. And the disciples are admiring the temple. It's just beautiful. It's massive. If you have a good study Bible, it's probably got a good picture, a diagram of it. These words were literally fulfilled in 70 AD. When the Roman general Titus and his soldiers leveled the temple. I mean leveled it. Literally, not one stone left upon another. Just leveled it. The Roman soldiers were led to believe there was secret gold hidden in the temple. So literally, they tear it apart, stone by stone, thinking it's inside the stonework. So they literally level it, looking for hidden gold. It wasn't there. I mean, it had gold in it, but it was not what they were thinking. The Roman historian Josephus tells us that the fire they set to the temple burned for months. Nothing was left but a pile of rubble and ash. So it makes sense. In this sermon, Jesus is talking about the events of 70 AD, events that for us today are in the distant past. Another Christian author, R.C. Sproul, believes that this whole sermon is about that event. In his view, the whole sermon, not just the first half, but the whole thing is about this event that takes place in AD 70. The problem with this view, and I don't have an issue with it, I think it is talking about this event in AD 70, but some have an issue with it, and some of the features of the sermon don't seem to fit the events of 70 AD. For instance, later in the sermon in verse 24, Jesus will say that immediately after these events, the sun will be darkened, the moon won't give light, the stars will fall from heaven. Okay, there's no record of that kind of thing taking place there in AD 70. Then in verse 26, Jesus says, "At that time you will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory." So you'll see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. Well, that sounds like the second coming of Christ, doesn't it?
Right. One of the writers that I've read had spoken on that writer didn't come. His thoughts were that Jesus did come. That's where the destruction,
Okay,
and that he came, but he didn't come back to earth.
okay.
So it was
He came and
respect-
stayed in the clouds.
Stayed with him, yeah. So he never came back to earth, but he came to the destruction of his angels.
Okay.
That was
Sent the
prophet.
messengers, the warriors, to do the work. Okay, that's an interesting take.
I'm asking because I have no idea, but couldn't the first statement in verse 2 just be completely different than the rest of from verse 5 on?
It could.
Like, you know, he says, don't worry about that. That's going to get thrown down one day. And they go, oh, well, when will this happen? And Jesus goes, he changes subjects. I mean,
Jesus gets pretty deep from time to time.
yeah, he isn't referring. I mean, I don't know. Like I said, I don't know the answer, but it seems like he's not, the temple, he already answered that question.
Yeah.
He's moving on.
Could be. That's a possibility.
One of the other thoughts is that the stars referring to those of high authority.
Yes, that it's symbolic language, apocalyptic language, like the book of Revelation and Daniel. Well, because of the way that the sermon ends, some think this whole sermon is referring to a future period. Some think it wasn't talking about 70 AD at all. It's talking about some future time that is immediately prior to Jesus coming back. Okay, so that's another interpretation of this text. This would make all the events that Jesus talks about in this sermon still out there in the future somewhere. For us, we typically think of things in the Scripture as being in the distant past, but this would be something that would be out there in the future somewhere, if you take that possibility. Many so-called Bible prophecy experts take this view. If you go and buy a book on end times Bible prophecy, they're going to use this chapter and say this is all talking about the future. So these are the things that you look for when Jesus comes back. Typically, that's what is known as the premillennial view. Certainly, the sermon seems to end with Jesus Christ's second coming. But the problem with that view is it takes the sermon out of its context. Since chapter 11, Jesus has been talking about the temple that was standing right there in his day, that it would be destroyed, that it would be barren like the fig tree. And this temple was destroyed, and these events fit rather well with AD 70. So to think that it's referring to some future rebuilt Jewish temple seems a bit far-fetched to me. I'm not going to rule it out, but it just seems a bit far-fetched. Certainly, go ahead.
No, I didn't interrupt that. The context is he's speaking to Jewish people. He's not
Yes.
speaking to those of him that everyone
Right.
is Christian. There's a new sermon that the apostles brought to bear, but this is to the Jews.
Yes.
It had nothing to do with
And his original readers would have seen AD 70 as fitting of what Jesus said, referring to the temple that they saw destroyed by the Romans in their own time. Now, others say this section is referring to both. Typically, traditionally, in churches of Christ, that's the way we see this. The first half is about the fall of Jerusalem, AD 70, and the second half is about the second coming of Christ. That he's got a 2-point sermon, part 1, part 2. Jewish rebellion of 70 AD and the future events surrounding Christ's second coming. In that view, Jesus starts talking about the events of 70 AD, but at some point in the sermon, he transitions to the second coming. Well, I can see a bit of truth in all of these possibilities. I don't know that I would draw a hard line and say, I've got it all figured out. That seems to me to be a bit prideful too. I do think we need to keep it in its immediate context But I think he can also point to some things in the future. I believe that most Scripture is dualistic in nature. There's a heavenly interpretation and an earthly interpretation. There's spiritual meaning and there is physical meaning. And this could be one of those texts because most of Scripture falls into that, I believe. The difficulty is figuring out when does Jesus stop talking about AD 70 and start talking about the second coming. See, that's a little bit more difficult. Which features of this sermon lie in the distant past for us and which features are still yet in the future? Well, let me share with you some of my thoughts. In verses 1 through 13, that's the section we're dealing with today, primarily, I believe, referring to the fall of Jerusalem, AD 70, instead of giving them the signs of the end of the age, the signs of, okay, it's about to all end, Armageddon, if you will. It's really AD 70 and the fall of Jerusalem. Jesus focuses on what isn't a sign of the end. See, that's why we misinterpret this passage. He's focusing on what is not a sign of the end. In other words, things that are simply characteristic, circumstantial, that you live in whatever time period you live in, these things are going to happen. That's the reason I put the Message version. It brings that out up here very clearly. Jesus goes to some great length to say, well, don't use this as a sign, don't use this as a sign, don't use this as a sign, because these are things that just happen all the time, whatever generation you live in. Wars, false messiahs, famines, persecutions. He goes on to say, this is not a sign of the end. They're signs of the times. Characteristics of life that fall in between Jesus' first coming and his second coming. They're just normal. Let's read this again. He walked away from the temple. One of his disciples said, "Teacher, look at that stonework, those buildings." Jesus said, "You're impressed by this grandiose architecture? There's not a stone in the whole works that is not going to end up in a heap of rubble." Later, as he was sitting on Mount Olives in full view of the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew got him off by himself and asked, "Tell us, when is this going to happen?" See, they're in awe. They're looking at this beautiful structure. Jesus has just told them it's going to fall. There's not going to be one stone left on another. They want to know when that's going to happen, primarily because they want to be there when it does. What sign will we get that things are coming to a head? Always looking for signs. Didn't Jesus get on to some people for always wanting to see signs and look at signs? And here his own disciples. Tell us the sign. Verse 5. Jesus began, watch out for doomsday, what? Deceivers. People that are always talking about the end. Watch out for them. Many leaders are going to show up with forged identities, claiming I'm the one. They will deceive a lot of people. When you hear wars and rumored wars, keep your head, don't panic. Why would he say that? Because most people do panic, but he's saying this is not a sign of the end. We'll always have war, always have earthquakes, and famines, and so on and so forth. He says this is routine history and no sign of the end. Nation will fight nation, ruler fight ruler over and over. Earthquakes will occur in various places, famines. But these things are nothing compared to what's coming. See, he's focusing on what is not a sign of the end. Now, many Jewish leaders persecuted Christians because the Christians wouldn't take up arms and join in the rebellion against Rome. But the Romans thought Christians were part of the rebellion. So Christians were caught in the middle. Their Jewish brothers and sisters didn't like them because they wouldn't fight. Rome didn't like them because they thought they were fighting. So they're caught in the middle. They were hated by everybody. Many Romans claiming they were guilty of horrible crimes. Christians were arrested, tortured. As the authorities tried to get them to turn on their Christian friends and family members, they doubled down on the torture and the persecution. Jesus is warning people, okay, tough times are coming, yes. Difficult times are coming, absolutely. But don't interpret it as a sign of the end. They're simply signs of the times. That's part of what it means to live as a child of God. Wars happen, false messiahs come along. Have you seen a false messiah in your lifetime?
Yeah. That guy from Florida.
Correct. Oh, Florida. I was thinking David Koresh.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. There's some guy.
Some guy from Florida. What was is it Charles Manson? Kept saying he was Jesus Christ. Others. Those are false messiahs. They're claiming to the world, I'm him. We had a member at a previous church that I worked with. He was not mentally well. He thought he was Jesus. He would tell you, I hung on the cross. He would also shine, one of those red lasers in the preacher's eyes during the sermon.
Maybe him and George Patton were comrades, because Patton always thought he fought in the Roman.
Okay. Persecution, all these things Jesus is saying, that doesn't signal the end. It simply is a sign of the times. The closest we get to a sign of the end of the age comes in verse 10, where Jesus says, the gospel must first be preached to all nations. That's as close as you get to a sign of the end. The one thing that has to happen, according to Jesus, the gospel's got to be preached to everybody. Isn't that why we're here anyway? The Great Commission, go into all the world, preach the gospel. So that's as close as you get. The last phrase of verse 10, the message has to be preached all across the world. Has that happened yet? Probably not. Of course, we're closer than ever. I mean, we have the capabilities with internet and radio waves and television waves and so on and so forth. People are still trying to go in places they're not supposed to as Christians to spread the gospel. So I think verses 1 through 13 for sure are referring to the entire Christian age, if you will, with special focus on events that are happening in AD 70. That's the best I can describe it.
One of the thoughts that comes to my mind whenever he made this statement a few moments ago about the inclusive of the future and also the past is a parallel of what has transpired as far as destruction and all of their religious paraphernalia, and then the future. There could be a parallel thinking of the two.
Sure.
The end result that we're actually a lot of people contemplating is actually going to happen similarly.
Yeah.
It's all going to come to an end.
It's a dualism, a parallelism, if you will. Absolutely. And I think verses 14 through 23 certainly have that dualism. We're going to talk about those next week. I think they refer both to this Jewish rebellion, and there are references to a future event of Jesus coming back. And I think he's using a layering technique where he uses language to refer to multiple events. I think that's what Jesus is doing. Just one modern day example of a phrase referring to more than one event. How many of you have heard the phrase, the day that lives in infamy? Okay, what day is that? Go ahead and raise your hand and give me one.
1941.
1941? Anybody else? What were you going to say?
December 7th.
December 7th? Anybody else? September 11th? The day that lives in infamy. See, that's a layering. You can be, it sounds like you're talking about one day, but in actuality, you could be referring to several days. If you're an American over 55, you've probably thought December 7th, 1941, the day the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Many people have used the same phrase to describe the terror attacks of September 11th.
Could you imagine, I bet you back in the Civil War from, 1861 to 65, I bet you people were thinking in times.
They sure were, yeah, absolutely. Well, multiple days have been called the day that lives in infamy, but those days all have something in common, right? Something terrible happened, incredible tragedy. Just depends on which generation you're talking to. I think that's happening in verses 14 through 23, but we'll worry about that more next week. I want us to look at several things here. Principles for living in the right now, the right here, right now, because you can get so caught up in this that you forget to live right here, right now. You get so focused on Jesus coming back, so focused on the future. Number one, no matter how secure life seems, nothing is permanent except life with God. Nothing else is permanent. Everything else is temporary. The sheer size of the Jerusalem temple created an illusion of permanence. They couldn't fathom that thing being knocked down.
My Bible says it took 84 years to complete, which means it was only completed for 6 years before it got.
It was all, yeah, it was
6
forever,
years.
forever being worked on.
20 AD to 84 years later.
The square footage of the temple courts, would hold 12 football fields. That's how big we're talking. It's a lot of Jews. Millions would come in and celebrate and observe holidays and sacrifices and so on and so forth. Josephus says that some of the stones used to build the temple were 60 feet long. Can you imagine? That's why people were so tempted to trust in the temple, put their security in the temple. Yet just a few decades later, that very temple was torn down stone by stone, leaving just a heap of rubble. What looked secure was in fact on the verge of total collapse.
Can be built, but man can then destroy them.
That's right. We try and build secure lives for ourselves. That's why we have medical insurance. That's why we invest in a retirement plan. That's why we invest our money, create goals for our lives. We plan our weekly schedules out on our phones. It creates an illusion of security because it can all fall and all go away in a heartbeat. It's a fragile illusion. It doesn't take much to shatter that illusion right in front of your eyes. One biopsy. One collapse in the economy. One moment of passion. And it all comes into an end. It really doesn't take much to shatter the illusion of security. But if you're a Christian, you of all people should know that nothing in your life is rock solid except the relationship with God. That's it. That's the only thing that is permanent and secure. Because nothing can take that away from you except you walking away. That's it. That's the only thing that can happen to that relationship. You can walk away from it. I believe Scripture teaches that. You might lose your family. Your finances might collapse. Your children might turn away from you. Your spouse might leave you. All these things are nothing but shifting sand. Only Jesus Christ is our solid, immovable rock. So be sure you're rooted in Him, that your confidence is in Him. Don't be like these early Christians whose lives fell like a house of cards when the temple came tumbling down. Number 2. We should be aware of speculating about Christ's future second coming during times of crisis. One popular I guess we'll call him a theologian, just not too many years ago, absolutely swore, put up big billboards, the end is this date. Oops, I misfigured. It's actually a few years from now. Oops, messed up again. How many times has that happened?
That was a book.
Yeah. Look again at the commands in these verses. Verse 5, he says, watch out. The word he's using literally means be prepared. Watch out. Literally is be prepared. Verse 7, don't be alarmed. Literally, don't be caught unprepared. What it literally means. Some think these commands are permission to speculate, to chart out the last days, even to the point of identifying the Antichrist and setting dates, times. That's exactly the opposite of what he's saying. He's just saying be prepared. When it comes, make sure you are prepared. Don't be caught unprepared. He's saying, make sure you stay clear-headed, sober-minded in difficult times. When you were a child, did you ever get left at home by yourself? Did you ever get scared? I did. You hear every creak in the floor, right? Actually, this building makes a lot of noises in the daytime. I don't know if it's the ceiling, I don't know what it is, but it is noisy. I think I hear people out here all the time. I come out and check, nobody's here. I'm thinking about selling tickets for the haunted church building. But I would, go ahead.
I'm going to say I tell you where it's at. Between the two structures.
Yeah, which is very near my office. I would hear every creak in the floor, every bush rubbing up against the window screen. You know, you hear all kinds of stuff when you're left home alone. My imagination would run wild. You think somebody's trying to get in. Well, Jesus is telling us to be watchful. Don't be alarmed. Don't be scared when you hear this and hear that. Your mind can play tricks on you. Your mind can take something that isn't there and make it there, right? Don't let your imagination get the best of you. You don't live in the what-ifs of the future. You live in the right here, right now. Jesus knew this revolt was coming. He knew that war was coming. He also knew it was not the end. Number 3. Actually, those are the commands I was just telling you. Turmoil and opposition will not prevent us from fulfilling Jesus Christ's Great Commission. Things like a virus shouldn't get in the way of the Great Commission. And what happened during this virus? What's the one really good thing that happened during this virus?
Internet.
Internet. All of a sudden, man, you can watch church services from all over the place. I have people that I haven't talked to in years all of a sudden texting me or emailing me and telling me, I'm watching your sermons again. I've had people from this congregation say, man, I'm watching 4, 5, 6 a day. Worship services. We don't let difficult times get in the way of the Great Commission. Look at verse 10. The gospel has to be preached all across the world. That has to happen. Things like wars, false messiahs, famines, persecution, those are not signs of the end. When we finally get the gospel message preached all over the world, now you can start looking for signs. Well, time is about up. Any final thoughts?
We're not going to be given signs, right? I mean, I don't think anything the Bible says.
Like a thief in the night.
And
When you least expect it.
I don't understand people obsessing about it.
Yes.
The end for you is when you die. I mean, why are you worried about what the world's going to come
Right.
to you?
Exactly right.
Live your life.
Jesus was very clear. And he even said, I don't know when the second coming is. Only God the Father knows.
I'm with Kathy. What she said.
Yeah, I mean, some people live, and not just far out people. People I know obsessed with it.
Yeah.
You know, they really obsess on it.
That's right. Okay, time is up. Make sure you scan the QR code. Take your attendance for both Bible class, and then when you get in the auditorium, do it again for worship service, please. Thank you for coming to class. We are dismissed.